June 4, 1944. The wind howled across the Norman coastline at 35 kilometers per hour, driving sheets of rain against the concrete fortifications of the Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in his command bunker near Caen, studying weather reports that showed no improvement for the next 72 hours. The German High Command had been certain for weeks that any Allied invasion would require perfect weather conditions, calm seas, clear skies, and minimal wind. Looking at the meteorological data before him, Rommel felt confident that no rational military commander would attempt the largest amphibious assault in history under such terrible conditions. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Rommel could not have imagined was that at that very moment, over 150,000 Allied soldiers were already aboard their ships, committed to an operation that would begin in less than 48 hours, regardless of the weather. The Desert Fox had built his reputation on reading his enemy's intentions, but on this critical morning, he was about to make the most fateful miscalculation of his military career. The man who had outmaneuvered British forces across North Africa was about to be outmaneuvered not by enemy generals, but by his own assumptions about what was militarily possible. Rommel's morning began at 0500 hours with his customary inspection of the coastal defenses. Despite the driving rain, he insisted on personally examining the progress of the TOT organization's construction crews. Over 4 million cubic meters of concrete had been poured along the Norman coast in the past 8 months, creating what Rommel believed was an impregnable fortress. The statistics were indeed impressive. 17,000 concrete bunkers, 6 million mines laid along the beaches, and 500,000 steel obstacles planted in the surf zone. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Berger, Rommel's chief meteorologist, approached the field marshal with the latest reports from weather stations across Western Europe. "Herr Feldmarschall," Berger said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "all indicators suggest this storm system will persist for at least another week. Visibility is down to 200 meters at sea, wave heights are averaging 3 to 4 meters, and winds are gusting up to 50 kilometers per hour." Rommel nodded, studying the barometric pressure readings. In his experience commanding the Africa Corps, he had learned that successful military operations required favorable conditions. No commander, he reasoned, would risk the destruction of an entire invasion fleet in such weather. "The enemy will wait," he told Berger confidently. "They cannot afford to fail, so they will not attempt the impossible." What Rommel did not know was that at that exact moment, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower was wrestling with perhaps the most difficult decision of the entire conflict. In a cramped trailer in Portsmouth, England, Eisenhower sat surrounded by his top meteorologists and military advisors, debating whether to proceed with Operation Overlord despite the terrible weather conditions. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief Allied meteorologist, had identified a narrow window of slightly improved weather beginning early on June 6th. While conditions would still be far from ideal, Stagg believed there would be a brief respite in the storm system, perhaps 18 to 24 hours of marginally acceptable conditions for an amphibious assault. The human cost of delay was enormous. Every day Operation Overlord was postponed meant maintaining over 150,000 troops aboard ships in English ports. Food supplies were calculated down to the last ration, fuel consumption had been precisely measured, and tidal conditions for the Norman beaches would not be favorable again for another 2 weeks. Eisenhower understood what many German commanders, including Rommel, did not fully appreciate. The Allied invasion was not just a military operation, but a massive logistical undertaking that had consumed the industrial output of 3 nations for over 2 years. 39 million individual items had been catalogued and loaded aboard the invasion fleet. From combat boots to tank treads, from medical supplies to communications equipment, every piece of material needed to sustain a massive army on enemy soil had been calculated, procured, and positioned. Meanwhile, in his seaside villa near Herrlingen, Germany, Rommel was making preparations for a very different kind of journey. His wife Lucy's birthday was approaching on June 6th, and Rommel had not seen her in over 3 months. The relentless pressure of preparing the Atlantic Wall had consumed his time completely, and he felt he owed her this brief respite. More importantly, Rommel had scheduled a meeting with the German leadership in Berlin for June 5th. He intended to make one final appeal for additional armored divisions to be positioned closer to the Norman coast. Rommel believed passionately that the Atlantic Wall must be defended at the waterline, that allowing the Allies to establish any foothold on the beaches would ultimately lead to the fall of Western Europe. His strategic philosophy differed markedly from that of General Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of German forces in the West. Rundstedt favored a defense in depth, allowing the Allies to land and then counterattacking with mobile reserves positioned inland. Rommel argued that Allied air superiority made such mobile operations impossible. Any large-scale movement of German armor during daylight hours would be decimated by enemy aircraft. On the evening of June 4th, Rommel held his final briefing with his staff officers. The Atlantic Wall now stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, but Rommel knew that the Pas de Calais remained the most likely invasion target. The shortest distance across the English Channel, the closest to German industrial centres, and within range of Allied fighter aircraft based in England, every logical analysis pointed to Calais as the inevitable landing site. Oberst Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, presented the latest intelligence reports. German reconnaissance flights had been severely limited by the weather, but radio intercepts suggested no unusual Allied activity. The enemy maintains normal shipping patterns in English ports, Speidel reported. There are no indicators of immediate invasion preparations. What German intelligence did not detect was the most sophisticated deception operation in military history. Operation Fortitude had convinced German leadership that the main Allied invasion force was positioned opposite Calais, commanded by General George Patton. In reality, Patton was in England commanding a fictional army group composed of inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and false radio traffic. The real invasion force had been assembled in ports across southern England under unprecedented security measures. Over 5,000 ships of every description had been gathered: battleships and destroyers, cruisers and corvettes, landing craft and supply vessels, hospital ships and floating repair workshops. The largest armada ever assembled in human history was hidden in plain sight through a combination of camouflage, misdirection, and the assumption that no one would attempt an invasion in such terrible weather. As Rommel prepared for his departure to Germany, he issued final instructions to his subordinate commanders. General Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Static Infantry Division, responsible for the Norman beaches, was told to continue strengthening beach obstacles and conducting defensive exercises. The division's 8,000 men were spread across over 50 kilometers of coastline, with most positions focused on the port cities of Cherbourg and Le Havre. Rommel's confidence in the weather delay was reinforced by a conversation with Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German Navy. Dönitz reported that submarine patrols in the English Channel had detected no unusual Allied naval activity. The rough seas and poor visibility actually worked in favor of German U-boats, which could operate closer to English ports without detection. On the morning of June 5th, Rommel departed his headquarters near La Roche-Guyon in his staff car, a Mercedes 230. The drive to Germany would take approximately 8 hours under normal conditions, but the continuing storm made travel difficult. Rommel's driver, Gefreiter Karl Daniel, had to reduce speed frequently due to poor visibility and flooding on several roads. As Rommel's car disappeared into the grey morning mist, the greatest deception in military history was entering its final phase. At airfields across southern England, transport aircraft were being loaded with 18,000 Allied paratroopers. Their mission was to secure key bridges, crossroads, and communication centres behind the Norman beaches, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the landing sites. The paratroopers faced extraordinary challenges. Dropping in darkness during a storm, many would be scattered far from their intended targets, equipment would be lost, units would become separated, and individual soldiers would find themselves isolated behind enemy lines. Yet their sacrifice would be essential to the success of the larger operation. Colonel James Earl Rudder commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion, tasked with capturing the German artillery positions at Pointe du Hoc. Intelligence reports indicated that these guns could target both Utah and Omaha beaches. potentially devastating the landing craft during the most vulnerable phase of the assault. Rudder's men had trained for months on similar cliffs in England, practicing scaling techniques with ropes and grappling hooks. Meanwhile, the massive Allied naval armada was already at sea, despite conditions that would have deterred most military operations. Admiral Alan Kirk, commanding the Western Naval Task Force, monitored weather reports hourly while maintaining radio silence. The ships maintained precise formations despite heavy seas that caused severe seasickness among troops who had been aboard for over 48 hours. The human cost of seasickness alone was staggering. Military medical officers estimated that over 60% of the assault troops were suffering from nausea and dehydration by the morning of June 5th. Many soldiers had not been able to keep food down for over 24 hours, raising concerns about their combat effectiveness once they reached the beaches. Technical Sergeant Robert Murphy of the 1st Infantry Division later wrote in his diary, "The ship is pitching and rolling something fierce. Half the guys are sick as dogs and the smell below deck is getting pretty rough. But we all know what's coming, and nobody wants to be the one to complain. We've been training for this for 2 years, and now it's finally happening." The complexity of coordinating such a massive operation under adverse conditions was almost beyond human comprehension. Every ship had to arrive at precisely the right location at exactly the right time. Naval gunfire had to be coordinated with air bombardment, which had to be synchronized with the arrival of landing craft, which had to coincide with the deployment of paratroopers behind enemy lines. Weather conditions on June 5th remained borderline acceptable according to Group Captain Stagg's latest forecast. Winds would decrease slightly overnight, and cloud cover might break up enough to allow limited air operations. It was far from ideal, but it represented the best window of opportunity for weeks. At 19:30 hours on June 5th, General Eisenhower made the final, irrevocable decision to proceed with Operation Overlord. "Okay, we'll go," he said simply to his assembled commanders. With those 4 words, he committed over 150,000 men to the largest amphibious assault in human history. The massive convoy was already committed to its course when Rommel arrived at his home in Herlingen that evening. He found his wife Lucy preparing for her birthday celebration, completely unaware that the most crucial phase of the entire European conflict was beginning just a few hundred kilometers away. German radar stations along the Norman coast began detecting unusual activity around midnight on June 6th, but the operators initially dismissed the readings as weather interference. The combination of heavy rain, electrical storms, and equipment limitations made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate threats and atmospheric disturbances. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, manning a radar post near Omaha Beach, noticed persistent contacts appearing on his screen around 0100 hours. "There's something out there," he told his supervisor, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber. "Too many blips to be weather, but too scattered to be ships in formation." Weber examined the radar display, noting contacts scattered across a 20-kilometer front. German doctrine suggested that any invasion fleet would approach in tight formation to maximize firepower and minimize vulnerability to coastal artillery. The scattered pattern visible on radar did not match expected Allied tactics, so Weber logged the contacts as probable weather interference. What the German radar operators were detecting was the massive Allied fleet approaching through heavy seas in precisely the scattered formation that German training had taught them to dismiss. The rough weather that Rommel had counted on to prevent an invasion was actually providing additional camouflage for the largest military operation in history. At 0200 hours, 18,000 Allied paratroopers began jumping from their aircraft over Norman countryside. The strong winds and poor visibility scattered many units far from their intended drop zones, creating exactly the kind of chaos that German planners had assumed would make night operations impossible. Lieutenant Dick Winters of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed in a flooded field nearly 3 kilometers from his intended drop zone. Separated from his unit and carrying only basic equipment, he began moving toward what he hoped was his objective, the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. The scattered landings that German doctrine suggested would be militarily disastrous were actually creating confusion that worked to the Allies' advantage. German communication systems, already strained by the weather, began reporting contradictory information from across the Norman Peninsula. Isolated outposts reported paratrooper sightings, but the scattered nature of the reports made it difficult for German commanders to assess the scope or intent of Allied operations. General Major Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff for the German 7th Army, received the first coherent reports of Allied activity at 0300 hours. However, German intelligence had been conditioned by months of false alarms and small-scale raids to interpret such reports cautiously. The same weather conditions that Rommel had believed would prevent an invasion were making it difficult for German forces to distinguish between a major assault and another diversionary operation. At 0400 hours, Allied naval forces began their approach to the Norman beaches. Over 5,000 ships advanced through heavy seas toward carefully surveyed landing sites. The massive fleet included 12 battleships, 23 cruisers, 93 destroyers, and thousands of specialized landing craft designed specifically for amphibious operations. The scale of Allied industrial production behind Operation Overlord was overwhelming. American shipyards had produced over 2,000 specialized landing craft in the preceding 18 months. British factories had manufactured over 1 million rounds of naval artillery ammunition, specifically for the invasion bombardment. Canadian plants had produced over 50,000 vehicles for the assault forces. HMS Warspite, a veteran battleship that had fought at Jutland in 1916, took position off the Norman coast to provide fire support for the landing forces. Her 15-inch guns, each weighing over 100 tons, were capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 900 kilograms over 25 kilometers inland. The irony was profound. While Rommel slept peacefully in his German home, convinced that no invasion was possible in such weather, Allied forces were already engaging German coastal positions. The man who had earned fame for his tactical brilliance and intuitive understanding of enemy intentions was completely unaware that his greatest test was beginning without him. At 0530 hours, Allied naval bombardment began along the Norman coast. Over 130 naval guns opened fire simultaneously, delivering a volume of firepower that exceeded the total artillery support available to German forces in the entire region. The sound of the bombardment was audible over 100 kilometers inland, yet German High Command initially interpreted the gunfire as another limited raid. The scattered German positions along the Norman coast were not equipped to handle a coordinated assault of this magnitude. Individual strongpoints had been designed to repel small-scale attacks, but the Atlantic Wall's effectiveness depended on mutual support between positions and rapid reinforcement by mobile reserves, exactly the kind of coordinated response that was impossible without effective command and control. Oberst Ludwig Krug, commanding the German defensive sector at Omaha Beach, attempted to coordinate resistance from his bunker complex overlooking the landing area. However, his communications had been disrupted by Allied bombing, and many of his subordinate positions were not responding to radio calls. The weather that was supposed to protect his sector was actually isolating his forces and preventing effective coordination. At 0630 hours, the first Allied landing craft reached the Norman beaches. Despite rough seas that caused several smaller vessels to founder, the majority of the assault force reached their designated landing sites. The weather conditions that German planners had considered prohibitive for amphibious operations proved challenging, but not impossible for Allied forces that had trained extensively in similar conditions. The human drama of that morning was captured in countless individual acts of courage and determination. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson of the 29th Infantry Division later recalled, "The water was choppy and cold, and guys were getting sick all over the place. But when that landing craft door dropped, nobody hesitated. We'd been planning this for months, and we all knew what we had to do." Allied casualties during the initial landings were significant, but not catastrophic. The combination of extensive pre-invasion bombardment, specialized equipment, and months of training allowed most units to establish footholds on the beaches despite German resistance. The scattered nature of German defenses, partially caused by the weather conditions that were supposed to prevent the invasion, actually reduced the effectiveness of defensive fire. German reinforcements began moving toward the landing areas around 0800 hours, but Allied air superiority made daylight movement extremely hazardous. The Luftwaffe, reduced to fewer than 300 operational aircraft in all of Western Europe, was unable to provide effective support for ground operations. The strategic situation that Rommel had worked months to prevent was already developing by mid-morning on June 6th. Allied forces had established multiple beachheads along a 60-kilometer front, and supplies were beginning to flow ashore despite continuing rough seas. The weather that was supposed to make invasion impossible had become just another obstacle that Allied planning and determination had overcome. At 0900 hours, Rommel received an urgent telephone call at his home in Germany. His chief of staff, Oberst Speidel, reported large-scale Allied landings along the Norman coast. The scope of the operation was still unclear, but initial reports suggested this was not another diversionary raid. Rommel's first reaction was disbelief. He had been so certain that weather conditions made invasion impossible that he initially suspected the reports were exaggerated. "How many ships?" he asked Speidel. "Are you certain this is not another feint toward Calais?" Speidel's response was sobering. "Herr Feldmarschall, our observers report over 1,000 vessels visible from Pointe du Hoc alone. This appears to be the main invasion." The magnitude of Rommel's miscalculation began to sink in. The weather conditions that he had considered prohibitive were apparently just another challenge that Allied planners had anticipated and overcome. The enemy he had fought across North Africa had once again demonstrated superior preparation and willingness to accept calculated risks. Rommel immediately began making arrangements to return to his command post, but the same weather that had convinced him no invasion was possible now made rapid travel difficult. Roads were flooded, visibility was poor, and Allied aircraft were already beginning to patrol major transportation routes. The irony was complete. The Desert Fox, famous for his rapid movements and tactical flexibility, was trapped by circumstances of his own making. His decision to leave his command post at the most crucial moment of the entire campaign would become one of the most studied command decisions in military history. By 1000 hours on June 6th, Allied forces had penetrated up to 8 kilometers inland in some sectors. German resistance was determined but uncoordinated, hampered by communication failures and the absence of key commanders. The Atlantic Wall, designed to prevent exactly this kind of breakthrough, was proving vulnerable to the kind of sustained, coordinated assault that its builders had considered impossible under adverse weather conditions. The German reserve forces that Rommel had positioned to counterattack any landing were scattered across a wide area and unable to concentrate quickly enough to be effective. Many units received contradictory orders, as German commanders struggled to assess the scope of Allied operations and determine where to commit their limited resources. General Major Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, spent crucial hours waiting for clarification of orders from higher command. His armored units, positioned to respond to invasion threats, remained in their barracks, while Allied forces consolidated their beachheads and began advancing inland. The psychological impact on German forces was severe. Many defenders had been told repeatedly that invasion during such weather was impossible, that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, and that any Allied landing attempt would be crushed at the water's edge. The reality of Allied success contradicted months of confidence-building propaganda and training. Unteroffizier Hans Müller, defending a position near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, later wrote, "We had been told so many times that no enemy could land in such weather that when we saw all those ships, many of us thought it must be some kind of exercise or mistake. It took time to accept that this was really happening." By noon on June 6th, the strategic situation had fundamentally shifted. Allied forces controlled approximately 80 square kilometers of Norman territory, and reinforcements were continuing to arrive despite ongoing weather challenges. The industrial and logistical superiority that had made the invasion possible was now sustaining operations under conditions that German planners had considered prohibitive. The contrast between German and Allied approaches to weather-dependent operations revealed deeper differences in military philosophy and national resources. German planning emphasized optimal conditions and perfect timing, reflecting a more limited ability to absorb losses and overcome obstacles through sheer material superiority. Allied planning, conversely, had incorporated extensive contingencies for adverse conditions. Multiple backup plans, redundant systems, and overwhelming material resources allowed operations to continue even when conditions were far from ideal. The weather that stopped Rommel did not stop Eisenhower, because the Allied approach to warfare had evolved beyond dependence on perfect conditions. Rommel finally departed his home for the return journey to Normandy at 1400 hours, nearly 8 hours after the invasion began. The same roads that had been merely inconvenient the previous day were now increasingly dangerous, as Allied aircraft began systematic attacks on German transportation infrastructure. During his journey back to the front, Rommel had time to contemplate the magnitude of his miscalculation. The enemy he had underestimated was not just more willing to accept risks than he had anticipated. They had developed capabilities that made previously impossible operations achievable. The lesson of June 6, 1944, extended far beyond weather forecasting or tactical decision-making. The Allied success in launching Operation Overlord under adverse conditions demonstrated the power of industrial superiority, technological innovation, and coordinated planning to overcome natural obstacles that had previously been considered insurmountable. By the evening of June 6th, over 150,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy, supported by massive logistical operations that continued despite rough seas and poor visibility. The weather that Rommel had counted on to protect his defenses had become irrelevant in the face of Allied determination and material superiority. The Desert Fox returned to find his defensive positions overrun, his reserves scattered, and his carefully prepared Atlantic Wall breached in multiple locations. The invasion he had considered impossible had not only occurred, but had succeeded beyond Allied expectations. German attempts to counterattack the Allied beachheads were hampered by the same factors that had made invasion seem impossible. Poor weather-limited air reconnaissance, flooded roads slowed troop movements, and communication failures prevented coordinated responses. The conditions that were supposed to favor the defenders actually benefited the attackers, who had planned extensively for exactly these circumstances. The transformation of Rommel's confidence into desperate concern reflected a broader shift in the strategic balance of the conflict. The Germans had built their defensive strategy around assumptions about what was militarily feasible under adverse conditions. When those assumptions proved incorrect, the entire foundation of their defense collapsed. The human cost of the miscalculation was enormous. German forces in Normandy, deprived of effective leadership during the crucial first hours of the invasion, suffered casualties and territorial losses from which they would never recover. The delay in mounting effective resistance allowed Allied forces to establish the secure foothold that would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe. For Rommel personally, June 6th represented the end of his reputation for tactical brilliance and intuitive understanding of enemy capabilities. The man who had outmaneuvered British forces across North Africa had been outmaneuvered by weather reports and his own assumptions about what determined victory and defeat in modern warfare. The Allied success in Normandy demonstrated that superior planning, industrial capacity, and willingness to accept calculated risks could overcome natural obstacles that had previously been considered decisive. The age of warfare dominated by individual tactical genius was giving way to an era of systematic planning and overwhelming material superiority. Years later, military historians would identify June 6, 1944, as the moment when industrial warfare reached full maturity. The ability to sustain major military operations under adverse conditions, previously impossible, became routine for nations capable of bringing sufficient resources to bear on military problems. Rommel's absence during the first crucial hours of Operation Overlord became a symbol of how traditional military thinking failed to anticipate the capabilities of industrialized warfare. The weather that convinced him no invasion was possible was overcome by the same systematic approach that had enabled Allied forces to cross the Atlantic, defeat German U-boats, and accumulate the massive resources necessary for sustained operations in Western Europe. The lesson extended beyond military affairs to broader questions about technological capability and national resources. The Allies succeeded in Normandy not because they were braver or more skilled than their opponents, but because they possessed superior ability to overcome obstacles through systematic preparation and overwhelming material advantage. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.